Good evening, folks. Larry Miles here in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm going to finish up, perhaps, I'm not sure yet, the Facebook video I started last night in this series called Highlights of Our Heritage on the life of L Jorgenson, 1886 to 1968. It's based on a series of articles his nephew, Dr. Dale Jorgenson, who's still living, wrote in the Word and Work in 1995. He titled his series there called E.L. Jorgenson, A Song of Christian Love. I see Dr. Jorgenson's daughter, Rebecca Jorgenson Straggart, is watching now. And we thank her for telling her dad about what I did on this thing last night. Brother Jorgenson was born in 1886 in Nebraska. His parents were Danish immigrants. We talked about his early schooling in Nebraska. Talked about how he got to school at Western Bible Literary College, which was in Odessa, Missouri, started by J.N. Armstrong and some other brethren who wanted to start a Christian college west Mississippi River. We talked about how he had met some folks there in Odessa. Especially he met his wife, Irene Doty. He had a good friend there, also Don Carlos James. And talked about how he met Brother Bowl there, who held a meeting there in Odessa, I think, in 1908. We talked about how he came to Louisville in 1909. How he accompanied Brother Bowl on a revival in Cincinnati, Ohio. How he went back to school there in Louisville, to U of L, and another school of music there in Louisville. We talked about how he became the preacher at the Highland Church of Christ in 1913. How he had followed Brother A.B. Lipscomb as the minister there at Highland. Brother Lipscomb was the nephew of David Lipscomb. We talked about how the Word and Work was brought to Louisville and purchased from Stanford Chambers and brought to Louisville under Brother Bowles' editorship. Talked about how while the Word and Work was published in New Orleans under Stanford Chambers and Dr. D.L. Watson, how Brother Jorgenson had a column in that. And how, if you go back in the archives of the Word and Work, you'll see he had many articles on that paper. We talked about how he prepared and wanted to put together a new hymnal to be used among the brethren. So we'll start back in our lesson today. I'm not sure we'll get through it tonight, but we may. It says, may we return now to the early 1900s. The life and pace for Brother Jorgenson was becoming a daily marathon. The great passion of his life to provide the church with a better, more suitable hymn book or song book was pressing more urgently upon him as he worked clippings, written, choosing material, designing his dream book. Irene Doty Jorgenson has written, during these years he was working on compiling of great songs of the church, laboring many times until the wee hours of the morning, end quote. Preaching and pastoral work at the Highland Church, frequent evangelistic meetings, a heavy writing schedule. Time spent on the book became impossible to carry. Although the first book had been published, he was already doing spade work for our number 2 hymn by that time. 1923, Irene Jorgenson writes, the load became so heavy that he felt he should resign from the ministry at the Highland Church. He did, however, take out-of-town appointments, thus being relieved of congregational responsibility throughout the week. He could devote more time to his compiling work, end quote. On a side note here, Brother Ray Noggle, who lives over in Sellersburg, who grew up in the Borden Church in Indiana, told me a story a few years ago that before he was born, Ray said that Brother Jorgenson used to come up to Borden to preach and ride the Monon train up to Borden. And Ray's father would meet him there and perhaps let him stay at his home for the weekend. Also, Brother Jorgenson would go down to Parksville, Kentucky, that's in Boyle County, and ride the L&N down there to preach at Parksville. The train went down there. That was the old L&N route between Louisville and Knoxville. He would go down once a month, I understand, to preach at Parksville. I was at Parksville a few years ago, talked to Brother Frank Preston, the current minister, and asked him where the tracks were at Parksville. They're not there anymore. The church is on a hill. Across the county road is Brother Frank's house. Behind his house is a cemetery. Frank said the train came right through where Frank's front yard is right now. And the station was up the street on the corner. And Brother Jorgenson would come down there and preach. But back to our story here. By the end of World War I, 1918, Brother Jorgie wrote, "I thought I was ready to print. Of course I wasn't, but I began. And then a rude discovery. The shock experienced by the young would-be compiler was his reaction to the business half of the Christian Music Publishing Company, or business. He needed to use songs published by the EOXL Publishing Company and those published by Hope and Rhodey Publishing Companies to realize the collection he wanted. He was confronted, however, with the choice of either using Excel's hymns exclusively or those of his competitors. That was not at all what I had hoped for and labored and studied and prepared to do. It was to be, as it lay on my mind and heart, the best of all the books. I had been so naive to think that surely money would buy anything. Enough to imagine that somehow I could get hold of that amount of money." End quote. We've got also Stuart Burks here. His grandfather, Brother N. Wilson Burks, was a co-worker of Brother E. L. Jorgenson many years and preached in many of the areas where Brother Jorgenson preached. Dwayne Schwignall also is watching. Quote, "Stymied by the Lord," end quote. Forced against any reasonable human expectation to depend upon the Lord, the dual problem of agreements and raising advance royalty payments led to the most wonderful thing, prayer, experienced in my life, and exceeded far better than anything we had dreamed of or asked for or thought, end quote. A trip to Chicago to talk to Mr. Excel led to a personal relationship with that aging music executive, song evangelist for two preaching evangelists, which opened the doors a blessing. "Go ahead," he said, "use anything you want. Mine or my competitors," end quote. At the same time, he fixed a very reasonable royalty figure. With Excel's contract as a model, Jorgenson was able to get the same deal with Rhodey and Company. To get the necessary start of cash, he mortgaged his home and borrowed a temporary small loan from his brother Alfred. The little family grew during the latter stages of the book's preparation. Martha Jane, the daughter of whom the couple had prayed for nearly 10 years, was born January the 9th, 1919. The Missouri Ledger of Odessa, hometown of the Doty grandparents, later described her as a charming child, intelligent, thoughtful, beyond her years, perfect manners, winning the hearts of all she met, end quote. Among those hearts she won were E.L. and Irene Doty Jorgenson, her parents. She was for them the focus of their personal hopes and plans, and they devoted themselves vigorously to her well-being and her training with love. 60 pages of the new hymnal were made and numbered when Jorgenson wrote, "The alphabetical lightning hit me." Despite counsel to the contrary, he redid the book plan. May the 20th, 1921, the first alphabetical hymnal of the world was introduced to the churches. containing 400 songs, each indispensable as the compiler saw them. The book was printed on special paper made to order by the Kalamazoo Mills, and printed and bound in a rich green art cloth by the Conkey Company. The original great songs contained standard round note notation. The new book made its debut in Louisville with a Union song rally during the very week of Council Press. The class meeting alternated at the Highland and Portland Avenue congregations was to sing through all 400 songs, the best 400 songs of songdom, with several visiting song leaders. R.H. Bowe noted the occasion with some satisfaction in the word and work. He wrote, "It was such a success and so enjoyable that we wonder why that sort of thing is not being done among us everywhere." Bowe was moved greatly by the spirit of the meetings, the quality of the songs themselves, and makes a point for the non-instrumental singing in churches of Christ. He says, if anyone had thought an instrument necessary in order to have beautiful, effective singing, I believe those song meetings would help have reversed his opinion. An instrument would have been a hindrance rather than a help. We got a new revelation of the possibilities and the power of the song in the Christian assembly. End quote. Finally, the editor of the Word and Work extols the virtues of his colleague's new book. Incidentally, the meetings were marked by an increasing appreciation of the wonderful songs Brother Jorgenson brought together in the book, rightly named Great Songs of the Church. The treasure set to music, beautiful word and sweetest melodies. On a side note here, a few years ago I was up at Woodland Bible Camp, Indiana, for the Senior Citizens Week. Brother Robert Gill, working together with a sister up there who had some old books. I went back to her house with her. She was in her 90s, still drove. She gave me a copy of the first edition, first year, 1921, Great Songs of the Church. It looked almost brand new. I still have it. It has somebody's name in it who the book belonged to. I talked to Buford Smith, who was a longtime minister there in the Duggar area, still living, who said he knew the lady who owned the book. Back to our story here. The Union Song Meet's success in Louisville, both a significant spiritual event and means of a new hymnal, convinced L Jorgenson that he should take the concept on the road. Thus, a vigorous program of song rally meetings began, which each year took him to various parts of the United States, especially to the west by way of Texas and southwest, as long as his health permitted. These meetings were resulted in many rich personal Christian relationships and were, on the other hand, successful in making the hymnal known throughout the churches of Christ in a short time. By August 1921, 3 months after the book's introduction, an excellent notice in the Word and Work reports, Great Songs of the Church has already received the unsolicited, unqualified approval of leading song leaders. 1937, the compiler could write about his first hymn book that it had found immediate favor and wide acceptance. The popularity of the book has never waned, but waxed from year to year, and that perhaps 250,000 believers sang Messiah's praise every year from its pages. A fringe benefit publication was the opportunity of introducing a few of the compiler's own efforts as a composer. Great Songs of the Church, number 1, contains My Sins, My Savior, a song often used as a communion hymn by churches of Christ, with a text by J.S. Monsell. There is a piece with words by Jesse Rose Gates, and a post-1922 edition, the song generally considered to be his musical masterpiece, Immortal Love Forever Full, with poetry by John Greenleaf Whittier. The Songs for Children section include his translation of the old German song, Can You Count the Stars? 1922, 50 notable hymns to please the British churches were added to the book as a supplement. 1925, they were incorporated into the alphabetical body of the book. Resignation from the Highland Church in 1923 afforded L Jorgenson time and opportunity to expand his experience in vocal and choral music, activities which he considered important in the sharpening of his ability to make spiritual and aesthetic judgments for the continued development of the new hymnal. By the time I had been working with and for the Louisville Chorus, a mixed group of 100 trained singers. Describing the activities of the ensemble, he says, "We had done in part public concerts, the great things of the Russian a cappella liturgy, much from the early Latin and others. Naturally, my taste and hopes for our simple churches and Christian schools had advanced. Everything one does in good music has a tendency to elevate his personal taste." He was already heavily occupied in marketing Great Songs No. 1, hymnal, effort which continued even throughout the Great Depression with good success. The song rally tours were still held regularly. 1926. A devastating tragedy struck the Jorgenson family. Their beloved child, Martha Jane, was 7 years old and an active and beautiful little girl. In mid-June 26, however, she contracted a severe case of pneumonia, which progressed very rapidly, despite the best efforts of the medical science available at the time. After only 1 week of illness, she died Sunday morning, June the 20th. The funeral services were held in the Jorgenson family home, June 21st, without any formal address, under the direction of D.H. Friend, a close friend of the family. Among many who offered love and wrote letters to E.L. and Irene Jorgenson during the dark days after Martha Jane's death, R.H. Bowl was perhaps the most constant in sharing written notes of encouragement and deep caring. On the day of her death, each of the next 2 days, Bowl, who was out of town preaching and could not get away to be with the grieving family, wrote careful, spiritual, poetic letters to his friends. The June 20 letter begins, "My dear brother, whom I love more than any man," he continues. "The one thing that came to me when I heard was this, that but just a little while, how short, and he that cometh shall come and not tarry. Then in a moment all sorrow and separation shall be forever past, as the day of the night. And the Lord Jesus, whom we love, will give you back your precious little girl to lose her no more." End quote. 1 week later, the faithful friend wrote again with prose, later to be utilized by E.L.J. himself in a tract he ultimately wrote on suffering. "When we pass through the valley of the shadow of death, God's presence becomes more real. We never alert God in hours of ease, but in stress and trial, he draws near to us and we to him, and he is made known to us. And I am sure that he is more precious to you through your deep affliction." I've been to the grave site there in Cave Hill Cemetery of the Jorgenson family. Irene and E.L. Jorgenson are buried. Also, the little girl, Martha Jane's grave is there. And also, Irene Jorgenson's sister, Rebecca Doty, is buried there also. 2 weeks later, in Bowles' message, written from Sherman, Texas, response to another letter he had received from E.L.J. in the meantime. The response makes clear the faith struggle and near depression being experienced by the bereaved young father. "I would have answered sooner if I could have answered more lightly, but your letter was so heart-searching and testing, so full of sorrow and battling faith and dreadful earnestness, that to answer it seems too great responsibility. Above all, I felt that I must guard against all mere talk. When one has passed through such a trial, only felt truth and reality can bring comfort, end quote. Saddened, chastened, but even more focused, ELJ was able to concentrate on writing, editing, weekend preaching, publishing during the 3 years immediately following his daughter's death. Typically, perhaps, it is though he turned to his work with an intensity which distracted him from the grief. Numerous congregational singing services were held in the Tuckiana area during the 30s. 1935, a mass song service with over 1,000 in attendance was conducted in the Bloomington, Indiana, the home of Indiana University. Other rallies held in Chickasaw, Oklahoma, Denver, Colorado, Berkeley, California, and Los Angeles. His work as publisher of the Word and Work required his continued application to the business of the journal. Articles he contributed to it were good enough to generate reprints many years later. However, the primary work interest of his life remained the creation of the best possible hymnal for the worship of non-instrumental churches of Christ. As he grew in perception and studied possibilities, he says, 1935, I was dissatisfied with number one. Though not with his sale, I felt I could now venture deeply and deeper and do much better. He then did some research, some inquiries, decided to go ahead, though the financial risk was great. The editing, winnowing, and choosing process, checking some 300 hymnals and an aggregate of 60,000 numbers, writing many letters seeking permission and copyrights, proofreading, all took its toll in time and energy. He writes, the stenographer knocked off at 5 o'clock, but I went on right there, night after night until midnight. For fear of my eyes, I dare not go any longer, but I never wanted to quit. Could hardly wait until morning to go back down. I loved it so. And the work you love to do doesn't kill you. September 37, I wrote the foreword along with my entire family to Chicago to check the final press proofs. And number 2 was on the market. The new book, which the compiler called The Supreme Labor of My Life, and the ripened fruit of 30 years' experience and research in the field of sacred music, contains 600 hymns and gospel songs. Ray Hall from Sherman, Texas is watching. I hope you go back and listen to the first part of this second lesson on the life of Brother Elmer Leon Jorgenson. And we thank Brother Hall for his mentions on my pages in the last year or so of his remembrances that his grandfather told him about Brother Bo holding meetings in the Sherman, Texas area many decades ago. The book price was pre-published at $0.50 or 50 cents per copy, increased to 65 cents after publication. The 5 sections of the book were divided into lighter gospel songs, the stately hymns of the church, special songs, a children's hymn section, and a complete set of indexes. The book was printed in both round notes and shape notes. Shape notes made it more accessible to many southern churches where people could still read the shapes. Immediately, the compiler hit the road again to conduct songwriters across the United States and Canada, so the book could be introduced and used. The first Louisville Song Fest was again at the Highland Church of Christ, September 24th, 1937, a rally which taxed the capacity of the house. A western trip was planned for summer 38, and in June of that year, Jorgenson also was in Winnipeg, Canada, with a mixed quartet to assist the rally scheduled at the Sherbrooke Street Church. During the summer of 1939, his tour covered 8,000 miles, all by train. Although the traveling constraints imposed by World War II inhibited the rallies tours greatly. By 1945, they were on again in an annual affair and continued till ELJ's illness, which brought to a halt in 1958. With the previous high of acceptance of Grace Songs #1, the vigorous tours, and the compiler's reputation, the new book had sold nearly 2 million copies to 10,000 churches of Christ and conservative Christian churches by the mid-1950s. The round note edition was published for a time during the 50s by the Standard Posting Company of Cincinnati, Ohio. The shaped note plates were taken over by Abilene Christian College in 1958. Relationship between the college, later to become Abilene Christian University, and the compiler remained cordial and positive throughout his lifetime. Besides earlier songs by ELJ, the new Great Song #2 added March's hymn, Hark the Voice of Jesus Calling, an arrangement of the traditional chorus, When He Calls Me, a nod to tradition to the musical setting to the benediction, The Lord bless thee and keep thee. Inside Flyleaf, later added to the book, provided space for Jorgenson's arrangement, Beyond the Sunset. Additional supplement of 70 songs were added in 1975, but never brought to the primary alphabetical structure of the larger hymnal. A little side note here, that song, Hark the Voice of Jesus Calling, when I was a student at Southeastern Christian College in Winchester in 1974, we sang that song on our chorus trip to Texas and Louisiana, and many churches in the Louisville, Tuckiana area. After 3 ministers had served the Highland Church of Christ in Louisville, following Jorgenson's resignation in 1923, 14 years later he was called back to his old pulpit. Thomas Wolfe's opinion in Look Homeward Angel, that you can't go home again, was happily not applicable to ELJ's second tenure in the Highland pulpit. In addition to his editorial and publishing works, the job entailed numerous meetings each week, pastoral calls, and regular series on radio sermons. Besides that, he did regular weekly singing classes at Borden and Sellersburg, Indiana, held revival meetings each year, and devoted a month each summer to the song rallies in the West. He was active as the Highland leader during the difficult days of World War II, ministering to families with men in the military service, coping with the usual shortages, including gasoline and tires, holding up the hopes of people during a time of death and fear. Beginning the last year of the war, an article he prepared for the January issue of Missionary Messenger addresses many of the fears of the future. We may be sure that this current year holds much of pain and sorrow. Oh yes, there will be songs and happy meetings, sweet associations with new and lasting friendships, but there will be tears and partings. More blue stars, some gold stars. Daddy, did God have a son in the service? Asked the boy as he gazed on the low-hanging evening star. Yes, said the father, and he made the supreme sacrifice. Elaine Channing Cox is watching. Hope she'll go back and watch the early part of this lesson. We're near the end, I think. Then the article again, author turns to the letter R.H. Bowe had written to him upon the death of his child nearly 20 years ago. Earlier, he quotes, "For yet a little while, how short, how short. He that cometh will come, and will not delay," end quote. Hebrews 10:37 in the Greek. Again, after 10 years of pulpit service, and after the war was finished, Jorgenson felt it was time to relinquish his full-time job as the Highland preacher, and upon his second resignation was named the church minister emeritus. 1946, he was turning 60 years old, and seems to have become depressed about his health and his own life expectancy. It is rather clear that he looked upon the lifespan of men of his own family and drew unwarranted conclusions. He resigned as regular minister and returned to the weekend preaching appointments in the country churches. In his depressed moment, he turned again to his old friend, R.H. Bull. His letter to Bull is not extant, but the answer from the old prayer warrior is, my very dear beloved friend and brother, it must have been a mournful day, and you must have been away down in the dumps when you wrote that note. But anyway, I'm glad you wrote it, for it gives me a good chance to express again my love and esteem and perfect confidence for you, end quote. Bull dismisses the law of averages and human conclusions about genetic determination. He tells of his own father's death at age 53, his mother's of heart trouble in her 50s, his younger sister's death at age 20 of tuberculosis, his older sister in her 40s. But RHB is still here, by the will of God at age 72 and a half now. And so will you at like age, as I devotedly hope and trust. So forget it. Your span of life is not determined by the family history, but in thy book they are all written, even the days that are ordained for me. Psalm 139:16. The Lord isn't through with you yet. End quote. This was an accurate prediction. In the January 1947 Word and Work, ELJ provides a report of stewardship for those who are curious to know how a minister may occupy his time when he retires from the local pulpit. The impressive statistics for his stewardship, 1946, in preaching in various churches, song services, long-distance travel to conduct preaching and singing meetings throughout the country, his work with the missionary messenger in Word and Work, to say nothing of ongoing business responsibilities with great songs in the James Missionary Trust, leave the reader a bit breathless over the man's sheer energy, and yet one may wonder whether he is, to some extent, recording the activity of his own reassurance of continued usefulness after the dreaded age of 60. Conclusion of World War II, 1945, response to an increasing militancy shown by many preachers in the editors of the Churches of Christ, in their efforts to disfellowship brothers and sisters who held various views opposing theirs about the second coming of Christ, the millennium, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, and even unity in the church. L Jorgenson began a series of precious reprints in the Word and Work. From these were drawn from early church fathers, the leaders of the Protestant Reformation, and most of all from the leaders of the Restoration movement, regarding their fellowship around those issues. He explained in the preamble, the question is not primarily who is right and who is wrong doctrinally on the millennial question, second coming, but whether the plain unity ground of the New Testament, Ephesians 4:1-3, together with the same established unity practices of the faithful fathers, is to be thrown overboard in our day in favor of a new system of creeds and super rulers in a kind of miniature Romanism, end quote. The installments continued through number 84 in 1952, and then were bound into a book through the agency of trust funds given to advance Christian unity. They may well have contributed in some way to the encouraging report Alex Wilson was able to give in the September 1994 Word and Work. Brother Wilson wrote, in many places, God's breath of fresh air is blowing away toxic fumes in this movement. I, for one, am encouraged by the magazines such as Wineskins, Image, and One Body, and by great gatherings such as Restoration Forums, especially Nashville Jubilee, end quote. August 1958, L Jorgenson experienced a severe coronary attack which damaged his heart. The medical consultants predicted that it could not heal. In this, they were proved to be correct. Following medical advice, he and Irene chose to live in California during the winter months, from which he still carried on a great deal of writing and occasionally some speaking. July the 14th, 1963, the Highland Church of Christ celebrated the 50th anniversary of Jorgenson's first sermon at the church. Although he was forced by his physical condition to speak from a sitting position, he delivered a brief sermon with both reminiscence and a challenge to the congregation. There were numerous visitors that day: Stanford Chambers, J.F. Stennett, and J.K. Scoggin spoke in appreciation of his multifaceted and long ministry. Ever age-conscious, but with more confidence than he had felt 20 years earlier, ELJ marked his 80th birthday with an article for his lifelong love of the Word and work. On that day, this was written, December the 9th, 1960. I have reached the mark that Moses mentioned on the measure of a long, strong life, 80 years and 10, if even by reason of strength 4 years. Psalm 90, verse 10. Yet in my case, it was not by reason of strength, but by reason of the measureless mercy of God's to his unworthy servant, end quote. 2 years later, so the quote above there would be 1966, not 1960. December the 14th, 1968, after enduring a great deal of pain for 10 years, he died at Claremont, California. Ernest Lyon, minister of the Highland Church of Christ, and a longtime colleague of ELJ, both in kingdom and of God and their musical interest, spoke at the funeral services in Louisville, December the 18th. Burial was in Cave Hill Cemetery, near the gravesite of Martha Jane, who had died 42 years earlier. Irene Doty continued an active role in the church, with her home life and friends, and the business of great songs, until her death, January the 12th, 1981, in Louisville. She is buried beside her husband and daughter. Thank you for watching this lesson about the life of Elmer Leon Jorgenson. I'm sorry for my coughing here at the end. Brother Jorgenson and his wife, they said, are buried at Cave Hill Cemetery. I've taken many people out there to show them the grave. On one side of the grave it says Elmer Leon Jorgenson, the other side Irene Doty Jorgenson. The little girl's grave is nearby there, a few feet away. Also is the grave of Rebecca Doty, the sister of Irene Jorgenson. E.L. Jorgenson, the compiler of great songs of the church, a hymnal that's considered by many to be the greatest hymnal ever published, at least in the 20th century, among churches of Christ. I want to thank those who watch this live. And if they've got any comments they want to make, please do so. I'll plan to do some more of these lessons about personalities in the near future. Thanks a lot, folks, and may the Lord bless you, and may we always be looking up and looking for the return of the blessed hope, as Paul calls Christ in Titus 2, verse 13.